Today we are going to practice multiplying by powers of 10. Here we go. Okay, so just a quick fact check before we start here. Let's just have a look at the number 4.5. 4 and 5/10. I just want to make sure you know going into this that if I were to move my decimal to the right hand side by one place, creating the number 45, that number 45 is 10 times bigger than 4.5. So every move of the decimal to the right is making the number 10 times bigger. Now if I were to take that decimal and move it to the left and make my 4.5 or 4 and 5/10 become 45 hundredths, that would be dividing by 10, or it would be multiplying by a number less than 1, a tenth. Okay, so every time we move the decimal once to the right, our number is increasing by a factor of 10, and every time we move the decimal to the left, our number is decreasing by a factor of 10. So those are important things to remember going into this activity. Let's start with the number 625. Let's multiply that by 10. Now it's also important to remember that in the number 625, I don't see a decimal point, but it's important to know that technically it lives right here. The decimal point lives directly to the right of the digit in the ones place. So even though we don't have to write the decimal place, the decimal point in the number through 625, we know that it lives there. Okay, and when I'm multiplying a number by 10, I know that that decimal is technically moving one place to the right. So if I were to write my answer, 625, and that decimal that used to be here but is now increasing by 10 times, it's creating an open space to fill with a 0. So now my number is 6,250. Let's see what happens when we multiply it by 100. Well, to multiply it by 100, that 625 that we started with, that 0 that we know is living after the number 5 digit, is going to move twice to the right, creating 2 empty spaces that I'll now have to fill with zeros. So even though we don't have to write the decimal place, or the decimal point, it still is moving and making the number 100 times bigger. So we have 62,500. We want to make sure we get our spacing right. That's what it would look like. Okay, same idea, let's multiply it by 1,000. I'm sure you can imagine that this time is going to move 3 times. So my 625 that I started with, that decimal is being moved 1, 2, 3 times, creating 3 open spaces that I have to fill with zeros. 625,000. Okay, but what if we're multiplying, well, let's do 1. What happens when we multiply anything by 1? It stays the same. That decimal does not move. But what if we're going less than 1? What if my 625 is being multiplied by 1/10? Well, logic would tell us that if times 10 makes it bigger by 1 place value position, then times 1/10 should make it smaller by 1/10. So my 625 that I started with a decimal right here, is moving its decimal point 1 space now to the left because it's decreasing in value by 10 times. So 62 5/10 is the answer. Let's multiply 625 by 100th. So my 625 that I started with a decimal here, has to get 100 times smaller because we're multiplying by 100th. 1, 2. Remember, every move to the left gets 10 times smaller. So 10 times smaller and another 10 times smaller makes it 100 times smaller in total. times 1,000th. So we need our 625 to get 1,000 times smaller. So when the decimal starts here, 10 times smaller, 100 times smaller, 1,000 times smaller. So the answer would be 625 thousandths. Advanced questions, you might see times 10 written as times 10 to the power of 1. Times 100 might look like times 10 to the power of 2. Times 100 would look like times 10 to the power of 3. 1,000 would be 10 to the power of 3. If you're multiplying times 1, the exponential form of that would be 10 to the power of 0. If you're multiplying by 1/10, you might see it written as times 10 to the power of -1, or times 1/10, written as a fraction. 1/100th could also be written as times 10 to the power of -2, or times 1/100. And times 1,000th might also be written like this. So this is only if you're doing some more advanced questions. You might want to pause the screen and just jot this down. Let's try some examples. 4 5/10 times 100. 100 might be written like 10 to the power of 2. Either way, let's get our decimal. The 4 5/10 that we're starting with has to get 100 times bigger. So this decimal that used to be between the 4 and the 5 is going to have to move 2 times to the right to create an open space here that will fill with a 0. So it's 450. Now what if we had 18 times 1/10? Okay, so that 18 that we started with, we know the 0 belongs here. We know that we need to get 10 times smaller, so that means a move to the left 1 place. So our 18 becomes 1 8/10. 3,740 times 100th could be written as 10 to the power of -2, or 1/100. So the 3,740 that we started with, we know our decimal lives right here, has to get 100 times smaller because we're multiplying by a number less than 1. 1, 2. It's going to move 2 decimal places to the left, giving us 37 40/100ths, or we could just call it 37 4/10 because that is an equivalent number. 5/10. Let's multiply that by 1,000. So because we're multiplying by a number that's greater than 1, we need 5/10 to get bigger. So our decimal, which originally was before the 5, is going to have to move 3 times to the right. Times 10, times 10, times 10. Okay, so it went from here, 1, 2, 3 jumps. I fill my empty spaces with zeros. My answer is 500. Okay, now it's your turn. Pause the video, try these on your own, and then come back and check your answers. Okay, so the 37 8/10 that we started with needs to get decreased 1,000 times because we are multiplying by 1,000th. So we're going to have to move this decimal 3 times to the left. 1, 2, and 3, which is going to create an empty space that I'll have to fill with a 0, and then put my decimal. So it's going to be, I'll rewrite this to make it clearer, but it's going to be 378 10,000ths. So 0.0378. Okay, our 1 and 600ths needs to increase by 10. So we simply need to move our decimal to the right one place, giving us 10 and 6/10. Okay, our 520 that we started with, decimal lives there, needs to be decreased by 10 times. We're going to the left one. So my decimal is going to go after the 2. I can call it 52 with or without that 0.0. Doesn't matter. Let's keep it simple. Okay, and lastly, the 832 and 100th that we started with needs to increase by 100 times. Need to multiply it by 100, which means I'll move the decimal 2 times to the right. It's going to live right here. So we're going to have 83,201. Let's write that nice. 83,201.